Hello there, welcome back to the channel. My name's Vince, I'm a composer, and in this video I wanted to discuss a few more sounds that I like. This is the second video in what I hope will become an ongoing series, just discussing some of my favourite sounds for composing music. All of the examples that I'll be talking about will be things that I've used on real projects, whether that's TV advertising, production music, animation, games, that kind of thing. I'm trying to focus on the things that I genuinely use and sounds that just are particularly tasty to me and that I keep coming back to over and over again. So the first thing on my list is transparent sounding strings. I've been a little bit obsessed recently by the sound of a chamber size ensemble. There's something to me incredibly special about the kind of exposed, quite vulnerable, clear nature of smaller size ensembles. I did a project a little while ago for Bleach music, which was called String Theory, really focusing in on that sound of like crystalline clarity that you get with solo strings. So trying to create movement and flow, but in a way that isn't this sort of huge ensemble kind of waves of sound. There's a glassy quality. And I think of this in relation to composers like Arvo Pärt, perhaps Tavener, Philip Glass is a good one, John Luther Adams. One specific compositional technique that I quite like and that I find myself returning to is the use of kind of connected pulsing strings in a way where it's just staying on a single note, creating a little rhythmic riff. The bow pressure is quite light, and perhaps the bow position is a little closer to the neck. Perhaps the bowing is happening mostly at the tip of the bow, so you get more of a flautando feel. And what I enjoy is having the musicians kind of play with the boundary between the kind of note and the ghost note, if you like, going into the world of overtones and harmonics and, you know, essentially squeaks, glorified squeaks, that kind of feature, so you get this very glassy sort of sound that sits on the boundaries between being kind of tonal, musical, and then also just being this kind of raw noise. The next thing I've written down is golden braid, and by that I mean sort of interlocking often piano, harp, dulcimer, ukulele, celeste, these sorts of plucked or sort of instruments which have like quite a strong attack and then just a decay to the sound. Using elements like that to create some kind of repetitive riff that combines different rhythmic ideas against one another, so that there's a sort of interplay, a sort of multi-level interplay. And then using that whole kind of layer of texture as sort of background accompaniment to the main thing that's going on, whether that's a string melody or a soloist or something like that. I just find it really fun to create these little sort of cells of rhythmic things which have a certain energy to them, but also I'm thinking of them very much just texturally, and also that I can use as a way of reinforcing the particular vibe that I'm trying to create. So it's never the same twice, the elements will vary depending on the mood of the track or the context in which I'm using it. The term golden braid is something that I stole from Thomas Newman. He actually refers to just a braid. For me, I like the word golden because it conveys something of the luminous nature of what I'm trying to do quite often. But a braid, Thomas Newman talks about piano braids in his Shawshank Redemption soundtrack. There's a fantastic interview by Rick Beato where he actually opens up quite a bit about his creative process, and they sit down and listen to some examples of his past work, and he has a little commentary. And one of the things that came up was his use of sampling technology, quite early sampling technology.
We used to call this a piano braid. This is me playing something and detuning it. Whatever I'm doing, and then and it'll come in with an octave on it. So suddenly it just kind of braids with itself because it just, I mean, I did a lot of that, of sampling phrase and then trying it in fifths or in octaves just to see what kind of inner patterns would occur just by, you know, accident. So that's the sample, kind of played more at pitch. So we used to call that a piano braid. I don't know why.
that's something that I find myself doing a lot, not specifically always speeding things up or stretching things out, but deriving additional material from something that I've recorded or played in, just extracting more and more and kind of iterating more and more out of that, and then combining that and sort of growing that material. Next up, we have block chord writing. Block chord writing is a way of taking multiple voices, whether that's literally voices or instruments, taking multiple instruments, usually of the same family, and treating them as a single voice, and having each note of a melody stack to create a particular chord as well. The chords that land on the kind of strong beats of the music are usually the most pleasant, and often the chords that kind of fall in between can be quite strange or a little bit more sort of tense, and so you get this lovely texture where you sort of have, it's almost like going over a sort of on a cobbled street or something. You sort of have you have this kind of moments of like darkness and shade, followed by moments of like sort of clarity and comfortableness, and you're sort of quickly alternating between those, but in a way that sort of matches the overall rhythm and pacing of the musical material that kind of surrounds it. The most traditional way of using block chord writing that comes up for me is big band style writing.
It's a musical. I hate musicals.
A lot of the beauty of great big band writing has to do with this sense of the big band kind of operating as a single organism, and then also within that organism having like separate families which themselves operate as sort of singular personalities, and then right down you kind of have a level below that where it goes more to the individual, and you have like a soloist standing in front of the band. So you have this like multi-level thing with like solo family of instruments, and then the whole band often playing, you know, towards the end of an arrangement, a big everybody all together. They call it a shout chorus. Also, I'm particularly fond of music that comes out of the 1950s that kind of mixes a bit of the orchestral and the big band sort of styles into what's often called light music. That specifically will often feature block chord writing in the string section, which is a sound that I absolutely love, and again something that I regularly get opportunities to have a go at myself through usually through production music albums that I'm involved in. So those are some more conventional contexts in which I use block chord writing, but it's definitely not restricted to those kinds of genres. One of my favourite keyboard players, a guy called Nick Semrad, who plays with Corey Henry and the Funk Apostles, there's this one riff where he uses block chords on a Prophet synth, which has, I guess it has 5 oscillators that are all sort of working in legato, and he just does this amazing kind of block chord riff that is very much in the same tradition, but in a much more contemporary context. I think for almost as long as I can remember, that sort of interesting mix of something that seems like it's one thing, but at the same time is many things, it's always just been particularly fascinating to me. So yeah, that's something that turns up in my writing quite a lot. The next thing on my list is strong grooves that barely hold together harmonically. Kind of atonal grooves, I guess. In Get Packed, I wanted to create some music that had an upbeat, driving kind of quality that would accompany the gameplay and the pacing, but also went along with this idea of being on the edge of chaos, because the nature of the game is quite chaotic, and you're constantly making mistakes. The game kind of encourages you to sort of fail a lot. So I created some quite janky kind of grooves that sort of stumble along, and particularly harmonically feel quite strange. They feel quite unrooted. Usually the way that I achieve this is basically by staying in a single key. So you can kind of think of it as a pedal tone. So I'll sort of have like the groove just staying on one chord essentially, but with like some odd notes thrown in, but then kind of coming back to the main note, the main root note. It could also be something that can occur in a more orchestral or score type situation. So in Jurassic World, there's a scene where you're going through this like train carriage and there are pteranodons sort of pecking at you through the windows, and as a player you've got to try and like duck down and move between the seats and time your movements just right so you don't get pecked to death. There's something quite innately rhythmic that you have to do to kind of bypass these pteranodons, and also the fact that you're on a train somehow, for whatever reason, I just came up with something that was very strong rhythmically, and did a similar trick where I was essentially staying around on a single chord kind of key area, but kind of going a bit nuts with the other notes that would come in, and really just focusing on rhythm. I guess that's the thing. There's a particular quote that comes to mind from a documentary I saw about Chris Potter's band. He's a jazz saxophonist, and the guitarist he works with, Adam Rogers, talks about his love of modern classical music.
There's a big modern classical influence in some of my writing. It's just this really, really long, non-repetitive, non-tonal melody over what I hoped would be a slamming funk groove, which it always is.
When I watched that, I just felt like it was giving me permission, like this idea that you could combine the world of atonality in modern classical music and slamming funk grooves. I just absolutely loved that, and there was something about that that just really resonated with me. I think particularly as somebody who trained quite a lot in harmony and sort of played classical music and jazz and learned about these kind of formal rules, there are just these moments where it's nice to sort of let go of all of that and actually treat it as a bit of a game. Can I still make some kind of musical sense, but make it super weird? Like, how far can I push it? So maybe that's something that, if you write music yourself, you want to have a go at. I highly recommend it. So the final sound that I wanted to cover for this short video is interacting sine waves, specifically as a way of creating interesting distortions and kind of overtones and basically little purring sounds that you get as a result of playing two tones that are quite pitch-wise, that are quite close to one another. You get these sort of waves or sort of vibrations that occur as a result. This is something that will be very familiar to you if you've ever listened to any like meditational gong bath type music, religious music, specifically from the Far East and places like Tibet. One of my big influences as a composer is the French electronic artist Eliane Radigue. She was really a pioneer in bringing this kind of music that was previously part of traditional cultures and religious contexts, but sort of bringing it a bit into the synth domain. So she used an ARP Odyssey synthesizer to really control the micro tonality, the sort of micro tones and pitches of different waves, and playing with the resulting vibrations in a very intentional way. And as a listener, I find when I hear her stuff, it really makes me pay attention in a particular way, and it is quite meditational. My first time sort of experimenting with this concept in the context of a project was on Augmented Empire. At the time, I was just starting to get interested in types of plugins that emulated outboard gear and sort of analog distortions and echoes and things like that. And I was playing around with the Decapitator plugin by Sound Toys, and I found that if I put a Fender Rhodes sound, which is a very pure sound, if I put that through the Decapitator, pushed it quite hard, but sort of just played a single note, you'd end up with quite a clean sound. But then the minute you introduce, say, a semitone above that note that you just played, or, I was experimenting with lots of different intervals, you suddenly get this whole world opening up of just different sounds and vibrations and kind of harmonics and things, with this kind of really rich set of tones, almost like whole chords would seem to appear just out of nowhere. that was something that I found was a great jumping off point for building music for Augmented Empire. And there was something to me that fitted very well about that cyberpunk, Blade Runner type aesthetic. This idea of something very pure and sort of innocent and clean, then sort of dirtying it up, but in a very specific way, kind of corrupting sounds that start off as very simple. So I actually incorporated this technique into the main theme for the character Willa, who's the protagonist. I remember I really wanted the player to engage emotionally with Willa, so I gave her this quite simple, quite kind of childlike theme in a way, quite pure, quite hopeful. She basically drops to the bottom rungs of this futuristic dystopian society after sort of being kind of creme de la creme, and sort of has her eyes opened to how things really are in this city and how things are run. And so there's a bit of a fall from grace and a bit of a loss of innocence in there. But anyway, at a certain point in her melody, I very deliberately use this technique of having two notes kind of overlap in a way that then created this sort of buzzing of distortion. Another example, which sadly never saw the light of day, was a experimental Bathtime Meditation piece that I worked on with my friend Talitha.
Let the whole body become deflated and soften, consciously letting go of each muscle. The arms, the legs, the back, all supported and surrendered into the support of the bath.
And I'd had this experience of listening to Eliane Radigue in the bathtub, which is full of all of these kind of warm vibrations and softly sort of pulsating tones. I'd had this quite profound experience sort of lying in the bath listening to Eliane Radigue's music on my Bluetooth speaker. And so I thought it would be fun to try and put those two things together of kind of meditation and like a sort of a well-being, mindfulness kind of vibe with this idea of being in the bath and using some tones like that to kind of enhance the experience. So we came up with this little recording which makes use of that phenomenon of fading in sine waves on top of one another and choosing intervals and tunings that just create interesting pulses. So a lot of the pulses that you hear in this piece are not pulses that I've created using an LFO or created by like programming in fader rides. They're just the natural result of certain clashes of sine waves, essentially. So yeah, another really fun jumping off point for composing, just sort of focusing your attention on the interaction between two sounds that are slightly out of tune with one another, or that are, a certain interval apart, and that kind of creating some ghost tones or some ghost vibrations that you can incorporate as part of your musical composition. So that's it for now. Thank you very much for joining me on this ramble through some of my favourite sounds for composition. I've really enjoyed having the opportunity to reflect on my past music and sort of think about what are the sounds that I keep returning to, or just what are the sounds that really stick out to me as fun little discoveries along the way and things that have sort of become part of my musical personality. And so, yeah, I hope you enjoyed the ride. Thanks very much for your attention, and I'll see you on the next video.
Let the knees soften out to the sides and keep breathing smoothly and without effort. Come back to a place of fluidity and stillness.